Wisconsin strategy, infrastructure independence. This is a report to the Governor Thompson Center on public leadership concerning an award that they offered in 2021 concerning preparing for public emergencies. My name is Thomas Zolper. I'm a professor of mechanical and industrial engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. And this presentation kind of gives an overview of some of the concerns that are present in the modern world as a result, say, of nuclear proliferation and all of that, and how it is that they influence public policy, and how it is that these concerns could affect the state of Wisconsin, how it is we could prepare to anticipate and prevent them. So I'll start off with just a discussion of what resilience is. Recently, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers issued a special report concerning electrical grid resilience. Now, this is kind of a broad and open term. They kind of go into the definitions and say it doesn't really have a hard, fast definition, but many people would define resilience as the ability to maintain some level of basic electrical functionality to individual customers or communities in the event of a complete loss of electrical service from the distribution system. And they point out a few types of events that are regarded as low frequency but high impact. One of which is a solar flare, that is to say a geomagnetic disturbance, which can arise from a emission of energy from the sun that can influence the geomagnosphere of the Earth and overload our power lines, causing them to shut down. And another type is so-called electromagnetic pulses. These could arise, as they say, a rogue nation can detonate a nuclear device in the United States and take out portions of the grid. So this is actually a major influence on foreign policy, at least with respect to certain nations, North Korea in particular, and you're probably all aware of the Iran nuclear deal that's currently being worked on. Well, the concern is that if these relatively small nations were able to obtain something like an intercontinental ballistic missile or something that can put a satellite into orbit, and if they could likewise prepare some type of nuclear warhead, then they could send it over the continental United States, explode it, and then thereby overload the US electrical grid. So there's been actually a lot of recognition of this possibility for several decades, but it's only really been the past decade or so where certain countries like North Korea and Iran have reached the ability to really present this issue. So there's been several testimonies of the EMP threat to the United States in front of Congress. One of the more recent ones is the presentation of the EMP Commission to the Subcommittee on National Security, Subcommittee on the Interior, and Committee on Oversight and Government Reforms at the 114th Congress, which was the 2015 through 2017 legislative term. So you can look this file up. It's readily obtained on just with a Google search. But I include a few comments from the presenters, George Baker of James Madison University, Vincent Pry, Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and then Mike Caruso, Director of Government and Specialty Business Development. Some of their comments are that in the midst of that crisis, North Korea orbited a satellite over the South Pole that passed over the territory of the United States on the optimum trajectory and altitude to both evade our national missile defense systems and, had it been equipped with a nuclear warhead, to place an electromagnetic pulse over all 48 contiguous United States that would have had catastrophic consequences. Turns out that satellite is still in orbit and passes over the United States with regularity. Fortunately, it didn't have a nuclear warhead, at least to the best of our knowledge, on board, but that's kind of the thing they've been aspiring to. And it's not just the United States that's concerned about this. In Britain, one of the presenters testified, I've been to some EMP meetings in Britain where they're actually protecting their grid, but their rule of thumb that it's 3 days till total anarchy. So if you think about it, if the electricity were to go out and heat, especially in the winter, you'd only have a few days to kind of figure out what you're going to do, where you're going to get food and heat and all of that before people begin to act out. And the concern is that if a properly placed EMP were positioned over the United States, it would knock out the electric grid for several months, some estimates up to 18 months. And they say we're talking about almost certainly within a year, you'd lose at least half of the American population, and some estimates run as high as 90% of the population would be at risk over the course of a year. So, what exactly is occurring or would occur if such an EMP were to explode over the continental United States? Well, few countries have actually done the experiments to figure out what that is, but in 1962, the Soviet Union did exactly that. They detonated a 3 kiloton burst at around 300 kilometers of altitude, and they found out that the induced electromagnetic field could overload the transformers and power distribution lines and thereby cause those to fail. And then there are a lot of controls and communications equipment which in the 1960s were fairly basic, at least in comparison to modern control systems. And they even found that those would be overloaded and would be likely to fail. Now, fast forward 60 years, and we know that there's been significant advancements in telecommunications technology and the development of microchips and all of that. And it turns out that those are actually much more susceptible to failure by EMP than the equipment of the 1960s. So the Department of Homeland Security has run several scenarios where some rogue nation might detonate a 300 kiloton nuclear warhead with a height of blast of 300 kilometers, and they position it right over the geographic center of the contiguous United States, aka Nebraska. And it's well recognized that there's three major types of pulses that emerge from such a detonation. You could say the E1, kind of pictured in this region, is a very, very fast pulse that occurs over the course of microseconds. The E2 burst is somewhat slower, somewhat less intense. That may take something of the order of milliseconds to pass by. And then the so-called E3 late time pulse creates a magneto-hydrodynamic signal which can impact electricity lines. And this figure here shows more or less the same three pulses that arise from a nuclear blast. The E1 blast, and you can see the telecommunications and controls equipment that would be affected by such a blast. The E2 blast actually turns out to resemble lightning in many respects, and so much electrical equipment has already been safeguarded against the E2 pulse. But then the so-called late time or E3 pulse, as I mentioned earlier, would have an impact on long distance transmission lines by inducing a current in those lines, which could overload the transformers. Now, it turns out that the E1 pulse is the most concerning for modern telecommunications equipment, but all three of them could pose risks to the United States if a country like North Korea or Iran were to obtain a nuclear warhead that they could put into orbit on a satellite. So, the impact that they'd have, we saw it could not only impact generating stations and transformers, but the induced voltage from the E3 pulse could overload transmission lines, causing those transformers to fail. And likewise, the E1 pulse could cause the controls at the generating stations to fail, substation components or equipment to fail as well. And ultimately, what that would result in is no electricity for the end use consumers. Now, there's been a lot of research on what exactly the impacts of this would be. This is an excerpt from a file from the Department of Homeland Security showing that, at least for an electromagnetic pulse, generation stations would go down, control centers would go down, transformers would fail, the internet would go down, radio emergencies would go down, global positioning systems, transportation, water, all of those things would go down. And you can see the acronym here, direct permanent effects, would be effectively elicited on all of these different portions of the electrical infrastructure. Similarly, solar storms or geomagnetic disturbances would have direct permanent effects on many of the electrical infrastructure. and then so-called temporary effects or cascading effects on much of the remainder. Similar principles apply to, say, cyber attacks, physical attacks, and even radio frequency weapons. And so it's been recognized for many decades that we've got to improve the resilience of the American electrical infrastructure against such an attack. And fortunately, based in part on the testimony of those representatives of various military and engineering communities, the United States has put forth money to invest in the resilience of the infrastructure. What we can say right off the bat is that the Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation has already piloted projects as of 2022, offering almost $1 million to improve the resilience of various community, let's say, resilience centers. But more recently, as of November 2021, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, I should put an A there, the abbreviation I'll refer to a few times through this presentation. And that actually is, I said, in part due to the testimony from these expert witnesses, allocates $5 billion for approaches to hardening and enhancing the resilience and reliability of transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. Now, this is only a portion of the funds dedicated to resilience activities in the state, and part of the scope of this presentation is to provide recommendations as to where it is that those funds should be spent. So to give you an overall overview of the presentation itself, the goal is to enhance the resilience of Wisconsin energy and information infrastructure against natural or man-made failures to minimize the likelihood of public emergencies. And I'll start off with this objective one: perform an audit on the Wisconsin energy infrastructure to identify available energy supplies, as well as vulnerabilities in equipment, design, network interfaces, and then later identify how failures of one system, such as information infrastructure, can affect downstream systems such as energy. So what is meant by infrastructure? Well, infrastructure is actually quite broad, and there's actually a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency that lists 16 sectors of critical infrastructure. That is the portions of U.S. Geography, economy, all of those things that ensure the continuity of kind of the day-to-day life that we have come to expect. And so this presentation focuses mainly on the energy infrastructure, but it's worthwhile pointing out that if the energy infrastructure fails, then we wouldn't have power to provide energy to communications equipment, and for lack of communications, we wouldn't have the ability to send information back and forth. And so with one portion, the linchpin, so to speak, of the general infrastructure failing, we'd have kind of a cascading failure of other portions of the infrastructure as well. And the cascading effects would eventually impact things like emergency services infrastructure, healthcare, public health sector, water and wastewater system sector, and even financial services sector. Frankly, probably about 12 of the 16 would actually fail. And so we'll start off with just kind of an energy audit, taking a look at the stationary energy, transportation energy, and then vulnerabilities in the infrastructure themselves. But it helps us to start with some definitions of what exactly is energy. So energy is the capacity to do work. You may have heard of kinetic energy or potential energy, but really energy comes in many different forms, such as solar, chemical, thermal, electrical, mechanical, nuclear, so on and so forth. It's really the electrical energy and thermal energy that are kind of the foci of energy infrastructure, at least when it comes to human usage. Most of us, like to have something like a television, radio, computer, what have you, available, and those obviously run on electrical energy. And then if you've ever spent a cold winter in Wisconsin, you've probably come to value thermal energy as well. And so if either or both of those were lost, we would suddenly find ourselves more or less put back in the 1800s. Now, there's several units of energy that are also used in this work, one of which is the commonly used British thermal unit. often used to characterize thermal energy, but it can actually be converted to electrical as well. And then the watt hour, often used to characterize electrical energy, but in other countries, it's very often used to characterize thermal energy. Another common unit is the joule. And we could say, as an example of energy, the typical energy content of one wooden match from burning end to end is about 1 British thermal unit. We'll be working in trillions of British thermal units, and that roughly corresponds to 1,050 joules. Now, a related term is power, and you can see I use the notation E dot. The dot is typically used in math and engineering to denote the rate of use, and I like to use that E dot to show that there is a direct connection between energy and power. And to give you an example, something like a light bulb is rated on its power. So power has units of watts, which are defined as joule per second. A common one in the United States is horsepower. You're all familiar with the ratings of engines. And other ones may be things like British thermal units per second, per year, or what have you. And to give you a little example, say a 100-watt light bulb is rated on the electrical energy that it uses, that is to say 100 joules per second, and you are billed by your electrical provider for the energy used over a period of time. So one 100-watt light bulb uses 100 watt hours in 1 hour of use. Some other definitions, we've got annual energy. This is very often how it is that a given system, like a state or a nation, is rated in terms of its energy usage. That is to say, the energy used over 8,760 hours per year, which is just 365 days times 24 hours per day. And then there's a related term called capacity factor, and that's really the percent of the year that that energy system is generating at its so-called nameplate capacity. So a 500 megawatt coal power plant operating for a whole year at 55% capacity factor puts out about 2.4 million megawatt hours of energy, electrical energy in a year. And so the term we just saw, nameplate capacity, is basically the nominal power output of a energy generating device. The typical nameplate capacity of a coal-fired power plant is about 500 megawatts. Nuclear plants tend to hover around 1,000 megawatts. And then natural gas turbine generators may range from around 50 to 500 megawatts. Some additional definitions. This is undertaking an energy audit. It's very much like a financial audit where you really quantify the energy supply in relation to energy demand, or you could say income in relation to expenses, to carry on the analogy of a financial audit. And even the terminology of energy is broken into two major types. One is so-called primary energy or resource energy, and this would be the raw coal that comes into the state, the petroleum, oil, whether refined or in its nascent form, or even natural gas that comes into the state. And these are in contrast to so-called end-use energy, where you might take that thermal energy of coal, send it through a series of conversions to obtain electrical energy for your house, or the thermal energy, chemical energy of petroleum, and put it into your automobile to be converted into mechanical energy to drive you around and about. And likewise, the thermal chemical energy of natural gas can also be run through a turbine to generate electricity to run your television, or very commonly used to heat your home, which is certainly one of life's necessities in cold climates. Some other definitions in energy analysis are sectors, and there's typically 4 economic sectors that are recognized. 3 of them are associated with buildings. So commercial buildings like hotels, restaurants, retail stores, hospitals, industrial sector, automotive parts manufacturer, chemical industries, electronics manufacturers, machine, metal working shops, and all of those. And then residential, our own homes, whether they're houses, apartments, mobile parks, whatever the case may be. All of these, you could say, are stationary because for the most part, they're built on solid foundations and they consume largely electrical energy and thermal energy for heating. Now, the other portion of the economic sector is the transportation sector, and that's associated with moving vehicles like cars, trucks, trains, airplanes, and all of that stuff. And it's associated largely with consumption of petroleum. And some energy analyses include a so-called agricultural sector, which closely resembles the transportation sector in its use of in its use of petroleum derivatives. If you think of agricultural planting and harvesting equipment, most of those run on diesel derivatives, and so they exhibit a lot of overlaps with the transportation sector. Sometimes a fifth is listed, and it's certainly necessary to include that for robustness, the electric generation sector. That is to say, power stations that generate electricity from fossil fuels. So to use some of the terminology that we just learned, we saw primary or resource energy is the energy that's comprised largely of fossil fuels, petroleum, coal, and natural gas, in addition to some other portions like nuclear. And then we've got a small, or a relatively small fraction of renewable energies, at least in the state of Wisconsin as of 2017. Now, these can also be partitioned by the economic sectors we saw earlier as well, where we've got the three stationary sectors: residential, industrial, commercial, and then transportation sector and the related agricultural sector. And you can see it's roughly evenly divided into quarters of the pie, so to speak. But these are all the economic sectors that have to make use of that resource energy as it comes in order to maintain the Wisconsin economy and quality of life that we've come to expect. Now, in contrast to that is the end use energy, which is typically a little bit less than the primary or resource energy. In these cases, it's still the same fuels, petroleum, natural gas, and coal. But in this case, much of the coal in primary energy is converted to electricity, and even a portion of the natural gas in primary energy is converted to electricity. And the economic sector division is similar to what we saw before, but this represents the end use energy, that is to say, at the point of consumption. Now, some observations we can take if we look in detail at, say, the commercial and industrial sector are that they both use nearly 50% of their energy as natural gas. And for the most part, these are actually heating these stores and manufacturing centers and all of those places. Their use is more pronounced in the winter, but as you might imagine, without these present, one would run into a lot of trouble fairly quickly. And likewise, the agriculture and transportation sector, as I mentioned, they're quite similar, you could say, in their energy sources. Both of which use petroleum derivatives. As we see, agricultural sector powers a lot of tractors, which often run on diesel fuel, as well as trucks and other agricultural equipment that may make use of gasoline, natural gas, electricity, and so forth. And then the transportation sector, as you can see, is fueled predominantly by gasoline, as most drivers in Wisconsin still drive gasoline-powered vehicles. A significant portion is diesel as well. A lot of over-the-road transport through semi-trucks and trains and all of that use that. And even now we know that a lot of our gasoline is blended with 5 to 10% ethanol, and so that's, of course, contributing as well to the transportation sector. Now, if we were to break the total energy use, that is to say primary energy, 1641 trillion BTUs, which can be converted to 481 million megawatt hours, if we were to divide that among the 5.8 million people in Wisconsin, we'd find that each person uses about 283 million BTUs per year. That is 283 million matches, or in the metric system, about 83 million watt hours per person. Now we can do some conversions and also convert that to the other metric unit of energy, the joule, and we see that the average energy use per person per year in Wisconsin is about 300 um, gigajoules per person, and this is very much in line with other data found for the United States. It's a little bit less than what Canada uses. They're at a northerly latitude, so they tend to have more thermal energy. It's a little better than Germany, Japan, Russia, in part because energy is more expensive in those places, so they use it more wisely. And then we've got like India and Brazil. They rarely need to heat their homes, and so that substantially decreases the energy needs of those nations. Now, we can also determine the average power used per person per year by dividing by the number of, well, hours in a year. 83 million watt hours divided by 8,760 hours gives us about 10,000 watts per person. That is to say, that's your average power energy consumption rate over the course of a year. So now let's focus on stationary energy, in this case, starting with electrical energy. So Wisconsin currently has 8 primarily coal power plants. Some of these can use a mixture of biomass like wood chips. They've got a total nameplate capacity of just over 6,000 megawatts. They generated something of the order of nearly 28 million megawatt hours in 2020. Their typical efficiency is around 38%. Their typical capacity factor is about 55%. And in 2020, at least, they generated about 43% of the electricity in Wisconsin. And this figure, as you can see, shows the 8 coal power plants scattered around the state, as well as the rail lines that provide them with the coal needed to operate. Continuing on, we've got 25 petroleum plants scattered across the state with a total nameplate capacity of around 800 megawatts that generated about 240 megawatt hours in 2020. Now, this is actually fairly negligible. These are usually only used during peak demand, often in the summer when air conditioners are operating, but it behooves us to at least recognize their presence in the energy portfolio of the state. Their typical efficiencies are around 30%, capacity factors 23%, and they make a negligible contribution to the overall electricity. Meanwhile, natural gas plants, there are 33 of them in the state, and you can see all of these blue circles are closely associated with the natural gas distribution lines passing around the state as well. And these are just kind of the large pipes. For the most part, for those of you who live in cities, your homes are probably connected to these smaller pipes that are used to provide home heating in the winter. Now, these natural gas power plants have a nameplate capacity of around 6,300 megawatts. They generated about 20.7 million megawatt hours of electricity in 2020. They have quite high efficiency, at least if they use combined cycle, and their capacity factors are of the order of 41%, contributing about 32% of the electricity in the state, in addition to a whole bunch of home heating and commercial heating and industrial heating as well. There's only one nuclear power plant in Wisconsin. Its nameplate capacity is around 1,300 megawatts, and it contributes about 10 million megawatt hours of electricity per year. In fact, you'll see a little bit later that 10 million is a rounded up value that I use to account for the electricity provided by nuclear energy for present and future scenarios. Their efficiencies are of the order of 35%. They can run 92% of the year, and at least in 2020, that single nuclear power plant contributed about 16% of the electricity used in Wisconsin. Beyond that, we've got biomass plants. There's about 26 total. These run on a mixture of wood products. I think most of these are wood products. Some of these are maybe wood products, but also like biogas from dairy processing plants or even municipal wastewater treatment centers. Likewise, a lot of these are running on biogas as well. They contribute about 1.2% of the electricity, but as we'll see, if we want to have an energy independent energy infrastructure for Wisconsin, then we have to lean more heavily on biomass if we can't make use of coal, oil, or natural gas. Wisconsin is also well positioned to receive hydroelectric energy. In fact, we've got the fourth largest number of hydroelectric dams in the nation. You can see several dams scattered along the Wisconsin River and several others kind of scattered throughout the state as well. Currently, the Energy Information Administration lists about 58, at least public utility hydroelectric dams with a total nameplate capacity of around 500 megawatts, providing about 2.5 million megawatt hours per year, operating at around 90% efficiency with pretty high capacity factors, providing about 4% of the electricity used in 2020. Beyond that, solar photovoltaic arrays are beginning to take root. As of 2020, there were about 22 of them in place with a total nameplate capacity of 41 megawatts, providing 317,000 megawatt hours of energy. Their typical efficiency is about 20%, and their capacity factor is quite low. The main reason for this is because we've got nighttime and we've got winter when solar availability is at its minimum. So currently they provide about 0.5% of the electricity used in the state, but we'll see that has to be increased significantly if we want energy independence. Likewise, there's about 11 wind turbine farms in the state with about 732 megawatt hours of total nameplate capacity, providing 1.6 million megawatt hours of electricity at 38% efficiency, 45% capacity factor, providing about 2.5% of the electricity in the state. Now that's stationary electrical energy. Now we want to look into stationary thermal energy. And in this case, we'll look at the three economic sectors that are regarded as stationary, so to speak, that is to say residential, commercial, and industrial. We can see in all three cases, they use a quite high percentage of natural gas to provide that thermal energy, and actually electrical is kind of rolled into here as well. Likewise, stationary energy relies pretty heavily on coal and natural gas to generate the electricity that's actually provided to those areas. Now, we look closer at the residential sector. I think that affects everyone quite similarly in that we all want to be warm in the winter. So from the Energy Information Administration, we can see Wisconsin consumes about 100 million British thermal units per year per household. And similarly, the electrical consumption is something of the order of 8,500 kilowatt hours. Now, these are both units of energy, British thermal units, kilowatt hours. This, as I said, is thermal. And then this is electrical. Both of those can be converted to each other. And I make use of dual units, at least in the information that I present in this presentation as well. Now, the residential sector home heating fuel, the vast majority you can see is utility gas, and this is what most people in cities and towns around Wisconsin use to heat their homes. A lot of country folks make use of liquefied petroleum, like propane, and a few, at least a reasonable percentage, use electricity, either directly or through heat pumps, and then a few use no fuel whatsoever. This is some data on the right on just the typical home size, 2,600 square feet of the average Wisconsin resident, and some of the fuel used by those, and that's kind of rolled into the energy audit that you'll be seeing in a little bit. Now, continuing on with just heating fuels, we can see that many Wisconsin residents use this natural gas for space heating, or this is actually the energy breakdown of a typical residence in Wisconsin. So 56% for space heating, 15% for water heating, and then the electrical is for appliances, electric lighting and all of that. And then a little bit is used for air conditioning, but that's negligible in comparison to much of the rest of the country. But even so, we can see about 70% of the thermal energy used in the state for heating in the winter is natural gas, and then the remainder is electricity, propane, and other fuels like firewood. Now, the reason I bring this up is because several European nations are beginning to feel the pinch of natural gas shortages. Germany is bracing for a so-called nightmare of Russia turning off the gas for good. France is concerned about a total cutoff of Russian natural gas, given the conflict in Ukraine. And even Great Britain is expecting to see an 80% increase in the fuel costs to heat their homes this winter. So Europe's seeing it already. There are limited supplies of these fuels, and so the United States is likely to see it at some point in the future. So some measures are already in place for how it is that one can at least reduce the amount of natural gas needed. And the big advice that any engineer would give is insulate, insulate, insulate. Well, currently about 70% of the homes in Wisconsin have double pane windows. Many homes are eligible for, say, spray foam insulation that would further improve their thermal efficiency. And some at least have made use of programmable thermostats that might allow the temperature of the house to drop to 50 Fahrenheit while the people are away during a workday. Now, continuing on to transportation energy, if we look at the records of Wisconsin motor vehicle registrations, we can see about 5.8 million unleaded gasoline vehicles in the state, an additional, say, 500,000 diesel vehicles, some propane even, and even a few methanol vehicles. But this is kind of an indicator of, our heavier reliance on petroleum derivatives to fuel our transportation to and from work, to and from school, the grocery store, and all of that. And so, at least as of 2017, when the most recent data was available, Wisconsinites have used about 2.4 or 2,400 million gallons of gasoline to propel themselves here, there, and everywhere, in addition to the jet fuel, the liquid petroleum, the diesel distillates, and all the other fuels that are used in the state. So to give a breakdown on the relative portions of fuel used for transportation, we can see those millions of gallons of gasoline, or about 300 trillion BTUs of thermal energy for driving motor vehicles, an additional maybe 50 million or so of diesel for those vehicles, and then we've got the jet fuels and all of that providing the energy to maintain or propel, you could say, the transportation infrastructure in the state. Likewise, agricultural fuel, here we see diesel provides the vast majority of fuel for agricultural purposes. Electricity can be, what's operating in corn silos, running fans and running equipment that's moving for various harvested materials around. And then we've got the other drying fuels like liquefied petroleum, gasoline for the farmers' trucks and all of that. But these are all substantial fuel demands. And so if we convert the actual fuels into thermal energy, we can see transportation takes about 290 million gallons of, trillion British thermal units of thermal energy, and diesel fuel another 100 trillion British thermal units of energy. And so putting all of this together, I got to thank the Office of Energy Innovation for providing a lot of the figures that I've used thus far. But putting all of this together, we can see then the 1,641 trillion British thermal units of primary energy used in the state, the 1,224 trillion British thermal units of end-use energy. And then if we look at all the energy that's produced in state, Wisconsin has no coal, Wisconsin has no petroleum, nuclear fuels, except for thorium, and no natural gas. And so all the energy we produce in state comes mainly from solar, wind, hydroelectric, and then biomass. And so we can see the ratio of end-use energy to in-state energy is around 11.5. Some people include in the denominator this 104, giving a value more like 6 to 7 or so. But the reality is they treat the nuclear energy generated in state as an in-state resource, and that's entirely realistic. But it's the uranium itself isn't mined in state, and so we can't technically say that at least nuclear energy is an in-state resource. So, continuing on with the latter portion of Objective 1, identify how failures of one system, such as information infrastructure, can affect downstream systems, such as energy infrastructure. This can be shown in a fairly straightforward plot. This is provided by the Resilient Society, showing what we could say are fractions of the energy infrastructure that we just looked at, the so-called electric power provided mainly by coal and natural gas, at least in Wisconsin, and then the oil and gas used in general for transportation infrastructure. If these were to fail, then there would be no power to run communications equipment or water sources or many electronic financial transactions. Likewise, for lack of petroleum derivatives, we wouldn't have transportation. And for lack of that energy, we wouldn't have emergency services, government services, and all that. So you can see the critical infrastructure is deeply interconnected, and the analogy might be something like a house of cards, where if we were to pull out the energy infrastructure, much of the remaining infrastructure would collapse with it. So this kind of leads into how stable our energy supplies are and how long will they last. Now, there's a term used in the energy industry referred to as the Hubbert curve, originally formulated by a man named M. King Hubbert in the 1950s to predict the longevity of petroleum reserves in the United States. And that has since been expanded to include coal and natural gas, in addition to petroleum listed as oil here. What we see on this, I should add that Hubbert curves kind of coined the phrase peak oil, and peak oil denotes that time in history when oil, the red line here, reaches its peak consumption rate, which is followed by a steady decline. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into play in this, one of which is, what are the available oil reserves or coal reserves or natural gas reserves for that matter. And while we do tend to increase them or find some additional reserves year by year, the reality is there's only so much of these reserves left. And as we cross those peaks, the supply is going to diminish. If the demand remains the same, then we're going to see prices for these fossil fuels spiraling out of control. So it raises several questions, such as what if we have supply chain issues like Europe currently has as Russia shuts off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? What if we have cyber attacks, not unlike the Colonial Pipeline that was shut down in the United States, which knocked about 16 states out of at least transportation fuel in 2021. And likewise, what about international sanctions? Currently, there's sanctions on Russia that are preventing Europe from importing their usual quantities and also raising the prices of those fuels. So returning to the figures we saw earlier, we saw that coal, which we obtain a lot of our electricity from, requires at least the railroad infrastructure to be transported from place to place. Natural gas requires the natural gas pipelines to provide energy to heat our homes and to provide the electricity, at least a percentage of that that's used in our homes as well. And likewise, petroleum, most of us still have gasoline powered vehicles, and the petroleum supplies, whether they're coming from the oil sands of Canada or the oil wells that are depleting in Texas, much of that comes into our state through these pipelines, or at least through distribution networks shown associated with them, shown there. And then the electrical infrastructure, as we can see, a lot of high power lines distributed across the state, some of the, say, intermediate power lines, and then down to, actual individual power lines that go to little houses scattered across the state. That's the infrastructure that is also vulnerable to electromagnetic pulses that we saw earlier, but at least petroleum and natural gas could be similarly crippled if there's not electricity to provide pumping power and data on flow meters and all of that to distribute. So how could these various portions of the energy infrastructure fail? Well, there's several different ways. One of the more common ones are just natural disasters. I think most of us have been in situations where inclement weather shuts off the electricity for a few hours. Many of you may remember the Texas ice storm that shut down much of the Texas electric grid for a couple of days in spring of 2021. Likewise, cyber attacks actually pose a lot of significant threats to the energy infrastructure, both electrical and petroleum infrastructure, where it was found that the Colonial Pipeline was shut down by a Russian hacker. And as I said, that shut down about 16 states on the East Coast for a matter of days, but could have been quite a bit longer if they were able to penetrate further. And perhaps the biggest concern are things like solar flares and, unfortunately, atomic weapons that, as we've seen, have been evaluated and pursued by certain rogue nations, at least to be able to hang a threat over the United States of shutting down their entire electrical infrastructure and triggering cascading effects onto the petroleum infrastructure, coal infrastructure, and all of that if they were to successfully complete that. So, if we were to lose the electrical infrastructure, we would be presented with a cascading set of failures whereby several other portions of the energy infrastructure would fail. This is a Sankey diagram provided by Lawrence Livermore National University, showing about 1,700 trillion BTUs of total thermal and electrical energy used in the state of Wisconsin as of 2017. This differs a little bit from the 1641 provided by the Office of Energy Office of Energy Innovation, but nonetheless, it represents the energy flow from the so-called primary sources on the left-hand side there through the four economic sectors: residential, commercial, industrial, transportation, as well as that kind of fifth sector, that is to say, electricity generation. Now, what we can see here is kind of what we've seen already is that petroleum provides the vast majority of energy for transportation. Natural gas provides a lot of energy for home heating, commercial heating, and residential heating, as well as a portion, at least, of the energy used for electricity generation. And then coal provides a lot of energy for electricity generation, which of course also goes into residences, commercial centers, and industrial centers. Now, if in a worst case scenario, the electrical infrastructure were shut down, then we would find that the petroleum, coal, and natural gas distribution networks would be shut down as well. And likewise, nuclear energy would probably be cut off too. So this would trigger a cascading effect whereby electricity could no longer be generated, at least by those primary energy sources, and basically the flow of thermal and electric energy to our homes, our businesses, our schools, and even petroleum to our vehicles would suddenly be shut off as well. And that's what I meant by saying, that properly located EMP could put us back to the 1800s in a matter of seconds. So how is it that we can kind of deal with this potential problem? Well, what we can see here is that several energy sources remain available. If you've got solar panels, you'd still be able to collect sunlight. If you've got a hydroelectric dam nearby, you'd still have electricity coming out of it. If you've got wind farms nearby, you'd still be able to get wind. And if you've got wood chips or dairy manure or what have you, you'd still have the energy from those sources. But nonetheless, you can see that the vast majority of the energy would be largely cut off unless we were to do something to remediate that. So, taking the energy sources that would remain in place in the event of a national electric grid shutdown, we would find that we would want to lean heavily, at least on as much hydroelectric and biomass energy as the state of Wisconsin can obtain, and then fill the remainder with solar and wind energy, which entails a substantial investment in photovoltaic arrays and wind farms. And what we'll see then as I proceed through an energy balance is that we may want to give further consideration to nuclear energy despite its controversies and challenges. But let's return then to the goals and objectives to enhance the resilience of Wisconsin energy infrastructure. In this case, we want to develop a long-term strategy to invest in energy systems and infrastructure that optimize local energy sources and enhance our regional energy autonomy. Well, let's look a little closer at the renewable energy resources that we saw. We can look again at the total end-use energy, 1641 trillion BTUs used in 2017. We see about 8.6% of that is renewable energy, while the remainder are largely fossil fuels and a little bit of nuclear, and then some electricity import, which is probably mostly fossil fuels as well. Now, if we break down the renewable energy, we can see the vast majority, almost 70%, is biomass. That is to say, wood chips, biogas digester gas, and even breaking that down, we've got about 19% of that would be ethanol used for the transportation energy. And of the remaining 11% or so, we see the vast majority of hydroelectric, followed by wind and solar energy. Now we can take a closer look. You'll notice that most of this sector is actually electrical energy. Some of it is electricity drawn from biomass. But if we look at the actual renewable energy contributions to electricity, we see that hydroelectric comprises the majority, and I'll be using this 2,500 million kilowatt hours as a baseline for hydroelectric. And we see wind is kind of creeping up over the past few decades. Biogas has remained fairly stable, at least since 2008 or so. And this would be coming probably from wastewater treatment plants. Then biomass also makes a reasonable contribution, and solar is just picking up. We can see as of 2017, it only comprised about 0.5% of the electricity used in the state of Wisconsin. So in order to become resilient, we've got to increase the levels of those, at least to the best of our ability. Now, recently, as of April 2022, Wisconsin released its Clean Energy Plan, and some of the objectives of this are to accelerate clean energy development, maximize energy efficiency, modernize buildings, that is to say, improve their insulation, and support electrical heating, largely through heat pumps, and then innovate transportation, moving toward low emission vehicles, perhaps electric vehicles, things of that nature. Now, the Clean Energy Plan proposes a few scenarios, one of which is a primarily wind scenario, and another is a primarily solar scenario. So we can see, as of 2021, kind of when the current data exists, projecting out to about 2050, requires us to substantially increase our wind energy investments and decrease our natural gas usage, as you can see right there. Likewise, cutting out coal and other forms of non-renewable energy sources. So this necessitates a significant investment in wind farms, at least in that scenario. And likewise, in the primarily solar scenario, we still have substantial portions of energy contribution from wind. It posits a few generations of nuclear energy to eventually take up some of the slack. I think that's actually up there. And then substantial investments in solar energy to cover our energy needs for that time frame. And you'll notice in here as well, there's a substantial decrease in natural gas. This is, of course, required based on the diminishing supplies and the associated increasing costs. So some other recommended strategies, at least in the area of modernizing buildings, is to begin to invest in air source heat pumps, update building codes to require greater and greater insulation levels, because the more we can insulate our buildings, the less end-use energy is needed to maintain that comfort level that we like to have through those cold Wisconsin winters. So this here kind of posits a scenario where, again, natural gas is gradually cut off entirely, and that's kind of realistic based on what we saw from the Hubbard curve several slides back. And some of that thermal energy lost through natural gas is provided by electricity, but much of the thermal energy would be saved through investment in insulation. So just some paraphrases of that is expanding the wood products industry, trying to maximize the biomass coming from wood products, including biochar and whatever other thermal energy we can get from it to offset those fossil fuels that are currently used, and endeavoring to procure more woody biomass either through collecting dead wood, manufacturing waste, forest residues, to replace the energy we currently get from coal, propane, and fuel oils. Now, beyond the Wisconsin Clean Energy Plan, there's also more of a national clean energy plan that was outlined by Princeton University in their so-called Net Zero America studies. And just to kind of paraphrase a few of the major takeaways from this, they posited about 5 different energy scenarios. These E plus denote high electrification, and then the B here at least denotes high biomass use. And I, through reading the material, concluded that Wisconsin is pretty well situated for moderate electrification and high use of biomass, given our large forests up north and our large agricultural land in the southern portion of the state, and then the dairy ring that we'll see in a little bit as well, all of which provide us with biomass resources. Now, this Princeton University Net Zero Energy Initiative recognizes the many challenges of transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, one of which, as we see in all of these figures, is maximizing the use of solar energy, which is really only available at high noon and the hours after morning and before dusk. And so this is one of the scenarios of where it is that our generating energy will come from: solar, ideally wind, and then some level of batteries. And then if we look at the development of that energy from 2020 to 2050, we see a lot of things, the same things we saw developed in the Wisconsin Clean Energy Plan: a gradual diminishing of natural gas and coal, a maintenance, so to speak, of nuclear energy, and then substantial investments in wind energy right here. I should say that was solar, and then this would be wind energy up there. And so I used the Wisconsin Clean Energy Plan and then the Princeton Net Zero Initiative to develop the energy portfolio that you'll see in a little bit for the state of Wisconsin. Now, it's worth pointing out that Wisconsin is not in the top 15 states for solar energy availability, and Wisconsin is 15th in the nation, among states at least, for new onshore wind potential energy. And both of those you'll see I kind of flex to the best of my ability for a proposed, at least preliminary, Wisconsin Clean Energy Plan. So, returning to Objective 2, develop a long-term strategy to invest in energy systems and infrastructure to optimize our local energy sources and enhance regional energy autonomy. So I looked at Wisconsin in several different lights. One is just some topographical maps figuring out where the energy resources might be in the way of rivers for hydroelectric energy, likewise where open plains are, maybe for solar and wind energy. And then if we progress to biomass collections, here we've got a map on the left showing the large areas where timber forest products, I guess you could say, prevail. The map on the right shows the so-called dairy ring, where there's a lot of dairy farms, showing especially this concentration here, these concentrations here, where dairy manure and dairy products or byproducts like whey materials may at least offset some of the energy needs for the state. And then there's several other maps that I'll be showing in greater detail as we progress. So we'll start with renewable hydropower. Not only an audit of what exists, but what is also available. So we already saw that there's 58 at least commercial hydroelectric plants in the state of Wisconsin, providing about 2.5 million megawatt hours of electricity at a fairly stable level. And then the rainfall in Wisconsin is pretty consistent. It's actually increased in the last decade, so it's kind of a secure resource worth investing. But it does beg the question, how much more hydroelectric energy is available in the state of Wisconsin? You'll see here, this is about 2.7 million megawatts. Here we've got a fairly stable supply of about 2.5 million megawatts for the past 8-10 years or so. And so I'm using that kind of as a baseline for the existing hydroelectric. And then I found two wonderful reports from the Department of Energy on so-called new stream reach development, energy potential in the United States, and then some information on U.S. hydropower market report, typical cost, you could say, of a hydroelectric plant. So starting off, Wisconsin already has a high concentration of hydroelectric facilities within the state. They've got the fourth most in the country, kind of trailing behind some of these East Coast states, and I think California and some of the other West Coast states. But it's this hydroelectric potential, so-called new stream development potential, is divided by the subbasins in the United States. You can see here Wisconsin kind of straddles two subbasins, the so-called Great Lakes subbasin, shown right there with the 04, and then the Upper Mississippi subbasin. The Department of Energy report kind of assessed the available potential based on annual rainfall, and then GIS data broke it into the available energy generation per year of all of these different regions. And if we zoom in a little detail, we can start with the Great Lakes Basin. We can see at least the northeast region of Wisconsin has some opportunity for new hydroelectric power potential. And then if we step forward to the upper Mississippi region, we can see the northwest, kind of central region of the state, and then especially this section of the Wisconsin River offers a substantial opportunity for additional hydroelectric potential within the state. All told, in this Department of Energy report, Wisconsin has upwards of 3.5 million megawatt hours per year of potential energy generation, and some of that is a little bit unrealistic to obtain, whether it would necessitate building hydroelectric dams on private lands, or other challenges of not only building the hydroelectric dams, but bringing the electricity to the public. So I've proposed a target of 2.5 million additional megawatt hours of energy for the state of Wisconsin. So we've already got an average of 2.5 million megawatt hours, and that new stream reach development assessment by the Department of Energy suggests that an additional 2.5 million could be realistic to obtain, giving us a total of 5 million megawatt hours of electrical energy from hydroelectric dams if we were to pursue that. Now, it happens that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act allocates up to 10% of capital project, or $750,000, for improvements to existing hydroelectric facilities if it can show that they can increase their efficiency by at least 3%. And several of the existing hydroelectric facilities in the state may be eligible for some of that money. Now, moving from hydroelectric to biomass, biomass is actually the most complex and diverse of the potential renewable energy sources within the state. I've broken it into wood biomass, corn stover, that is to say an agricultural byproduct, manure, another agricultural byproduct, landfill waste, and then all of these are solid biomass. And then I also included liquid biomass, that is to say the wastewater generated in the various cities around the state. And a second form of biomass energy comes in the way of transportation fuels. We already saw a brief energy audit on the ethanol production per year in the state, and then the soy biodiesel production in the state as well. So starting with just biomass, There's 26 existing biomass plants, and this figure here shows kind of the biomass distribution in 1,000 tons, that is to say metric tons per year, where 1 metric ton corresponds to about 90% of a U.S. customary short ton, which we're accustomed to being 2,000 pounds. And I started with the production for the U.S. Department of Agriculture of Wisconsin forests, where they tally about 650 million dry tons of forest exists in the state of Wisconsin thus far. If we were to use that at a sustainable rate of, 1% of that per year over 100 years, we could at least theoretically generate about 84.4 trillion British thermal units of energy per year, which corresponds to something of the order of 24.7 million megawatt hours of thermal energy. And if that were converted to electrical energy at 30% efficiency, we might see something of the order of 7.4 million megawatt hours per year. That's a little bit unrealistic. That Wisconsin Forest publication goes in great detail on the available growing stock as well as the actual volume of wood produced in the state, but we wouldn't want to just cut down all the trees, even at a sustainable rate, just to burn them for electricity. However, it is very reasonable to make use of the so-called residues from forestry activities, whether it's bark residues left in the field or coarse residues and fine residues from the lumber mills. All of these are eligible, at least for consideration, for heat generation and or electricity generation. Now, I found a really nice energy audit of the state of Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Strategic Bioenergy Feedstock Assessment provided by the Wisconsin Bioenergy Initiative. And they went into great detail on the annual production of wood residuals, grasses, and corn stover, that is to say byproducts, manure, and then solid waste, like landfill waste generated in the state. And they also provided recommended pathways for using that energy, such as direct combustion of wood chips for electricity and heat, pyrolysis, gasification, or saccharification and fermentation of grasses and corn stover to produce either solid fuels or liquid fuels, potentially for transportation. And then even the solid waste, making use of existing anaerobic digestion to provide gaseous fuels for ideally heat and power as well. And they provide excellent recommendations for the best use of those biomass resources. As I said, woody materials for thermal conversions, herbaceous materials for biological conversions, corn stover. In general, I think biological conversions may be considered, but thermal ones are eligible as well. Paper waste for thermal applications, manure for biological conversions through digesters, and then distiller dry gains for biological conversions as well. So this Wisconsin Bioenergy Initiative tallied up the available industrial roundwood harvested in the northern section of the state, as well as the harvest residuals. That's what's left by the lumberjacks after they harvest the forest materials, remains in the wood, but at least could theoretically be trucked out and sent for wood chipping and combustion. Likewise, there is additional roundwood scattered around the state, as we saw in that U.S. Forestry publication, that could be considered for use at sustainable states within the state of Wisconsin. Elsewhere, in the more agricultural regions where corn and beans are produced, there's a good amount of stover that is left over from the harvest processes. Likewise, certain regions of the state have conservation, restoration, and prairie grasses that would be available, at least for consideration if the need arose. And then this figure kind of depicts the dairy ring scattered around the state, which has high quantities of cow manure, as well as dairy byproducts such as whey that is used in the cheese manufacturing processes, both of which could be considered and may produce upwards of 12 million megawatt hours per year of thermal energy available for production. So if we were looking to greater detail on the dairy industry alone, here we can see the dairy ring and the associated dairy farm density. Here we have dairy food production facilities. So these are mainly cheese manufacturers as well as, say, milk, yogurt, ice cream, things like that. And on the one hand, the manure is eligible for anaerobic digestion. Likewise, the cheese, butter, waste materials, namely whey, which tends to be co-located with the dairy farms or at least in near proximity, is also eligible for anaerobic digestion. And then if we look at the existing municipal anaerobic digesters scattered around the states, these are actually all located in population centers. But really, we could consider either augmenting the existing municipal anaerobic digesters with the dairy waste to perhaps bring them to sustainable levels, or build additional anaerobic digesters to make use of the dairy waste as on site, more or less. And so the Wisconsin Bioenergy Initiative proposed to use so-called aggregation centers for wood products, kind of shown in these upper three here, and then woody crops shown down there. And likewise, corn stover and CRP grasses, corn stover right here, and then CRP grasses right there. And they estimated that if combinations of various power plants could be produced with the total nameplate capacities, kind of as shown in those areas there. Now, it is worthwhile, again, to attain energy autonomy. One of the steps toward energy independence and energy resilience, worthwhile to consider these at least as something to fall back on. And it's also worth mentioning that a lot of the existing coal-fired power plants can actually be fueled with wood residuals such as wood chips and whatnot. In fact, I know that in Ashland, Wisconsin, there used to be a coal-fired power plant which has since been converted to burn wood biomass chips. And actually, Ashland Light and Power Company was the first in the nation to convert their coal-fired power plants to wood biomass. And so several other existing coal-fired power plants would be eligible for those conversions. So convert coal plants to wood biomass whenever possible. And then there's some control strategies we have to consider when we look at the available in-state renewable resources, one of which is to not even use the biomass in the summer, at least if it's solid biomass, just store it on site, save it up for winter, because in the summer, at least if we design properly, we'd be able to make use of photovoltaic arrays and then use the deficient sunlight in the winter to be offset with the stored up biomass that's stored during the summer and then used in the winter. And in most of these cases as well, one would want to use combined heat and power whenever possible. That is to say, co-locate your biomass power plants near hospitals or population centers such that you can generate electricity with a coal-fired power plant and then use combined heat and power to extract at least some of the heat from the combustion process and use it to supplement the heating energy needed by. Now, if we tally up all of that biomass energy that's available in the state of Wisconsin, we find we've got a pretty significant opportunity for increasing the energy use. So we'll start off with just kind of a look at the roundwood harvested. That's around 3.4 million dry tons per year. But that actually is a high value wood product, so we wouldn't want to burn that. We'd rather sell it to the lumber industry or use it for forest products. Likewise, wood processing residuals are often used for high value wood products like fiberboard, plywood, things like that. So that wouldn't really be eligible for consideration either. Nonetheless, the wood harvest residuals, 1.5 million tons per year, wood processing residuals, wood energy crops, wood harvest, potential additional wood harvest, all of those could be included. So let me actually X out the two high value crops that I didn't include in the tally and then show the remainder there. And so I used the rates listed by the Biomass Wisconsin Bioenergy Initiative of 6,500 British thermal units per pound of woody material, 2,500 BTUs per pound of biogas materials. And then I tallied the total thermal energy available in megawatt hours and British thermal units per year. So we can see a total of 64,800,000 million megawatt hours of thermal energy. And if we convert that to British thermal units, it's about 221 trillion. It's worth pointing out that we already use about 100 trillion British thermal units per year. So this would be an addition of 120 trillion British thermal units per year in thermal energy. And it could either all be used as thermal energy or it can be converted to electrical energy. And here I've got the two columns of electrical energy in units of megawatt hours for the metric system and trillion British thermal units for the US customary system. So both of those are directions that this biomass energy could be placed. At least for what you'll see in a little bit, I took this 64,800,000 and divided it into evenly into 32,400,000 of thermal energy and then 32,400,000 converted to at 30% efficiency for electrical energy. But you'll see that's kind of where that number comes from in the forthcoming slides. Now, continuing with biomass energy, we can also consider liquid biomass, that is to say wastewater that is essentially flushed down the toilet. So if you recall back to the 16 sectors of critical infrastructure, water and wastewater treatment plants are part of the critical infrastructure that is essential to maintain in the event of a public emergency. Every day, they do the perhaps under-recognized task of preventing waterborne illnesses, which were the scourge of the 1800s, typhoid, diphtheria, and all those things. They treat millions of gallons of polluted water every day and return it as fresh, clean water. But they do require a substantial energy contribution for their pumps, heaters, aerators, and even the offices and control rooms. However, they also produce substantial energy through anaerobic digestion of that biomass sewage. And in some cases, the energy they produce is almost enough to cover the energy they consume. So they could almost become standalone if we kind of gave a little additional push. Now, to put it into perspective, Wisconsin has 650 public wastewater treatment centers and 360 private ones. About 85% treat less than 1 million gallons per day, and that is to say they take the incoming wastewater from sewage systems, from runoff and city gutters and all of that, and they send it through some aeration systems and then into an anaerobic digester where they separate the biosolids and then provide clean water either back to a source or at least clean it for release into the environment. Now, the remaining wastewater treatment centers operate on the same principles, but they treat more like greater than 1 million gallons per day, and they have an additional process. On the one hand, they take the influent, they send it through the particle separators, they send it to an anaerobic digester, but then they are able to vent off the digester gas, which is essentially natural gas, which can be combusted in an engine generator, whereby they can capture some of the waste heat and provide electricity to support at least some of the pumps and aerators in the wastewater treatment plant. Now, these are just some information from Focus on Energy on the size of the wastewater treatment centers, the number of facilities, and the average design flow for those facilities, as well as the energy requirements for those different wastewater treatment centers. Now, it happens that it's only the big ones treating more than 1 million gallons per day of water that are close to closing the energy loop, so to speak, where the energy they generate from anaerobic digesters is nearly enough to provide the energy to operate the wastewater treatment plant. And this then is kind of a depiction of the number of facilities. Here are the so-called small facilities. Here are the so-called large facilities. Their annual flow rates shown there, their annual energy usage, and then their potential, well, we could say their total energy demands, around 904,000 megawatt hours to operate all the wastewater treatment centers. That is to say, to keep your water clean and prevent waterborne illnesses. And that equates to about 3 trillion BTUs of energy demand per year. Now, it's been pointed out that of the 88 large wastewater treatment plants in the state, they've got a total energy generating potential of about 50 megawatt nameplate capacity. They treat about half of the water in the state, but if we were to look at the total nameplate capacity of 50 megawatts between these intermediate size and then some of the larger size ones, I flip those, their annual energy production is something of the order of 438,000 megawatt hours of energy, or 1.5 trillion BTUs. And as we saw, that's about half of the energy demand for operating wastewater treatment centers on statewide. And so this is an area where one opportunity exists for critical infrastructure, that is to say wastewater treatment plants, which have to operate in an emergency, public emergency, can, at least in some cases, provide a majority of the energy that they need to operate and ensure, public safety. So we covered solid biomass and liquid biomass, at least in kind of the more primitive forms, but there's a type of solid liquid biomass that I kind of kept separate because I thought it was more suited toward transportation industry sector, I should say, rather than the stationary energy sectors, that is to say residential, commercial, and industrial. And so let's move on then to corn ethanol and soy biodiesel as they stand in the state and the potential that the state has. So currently there's 2 soy biodiesel plants in Wisconsin that produce around 32 million gallons per year of energy, or something of the order of 1.3 million megawatt hours of thermal energy. And they provide about 3%, you could say. The biodiesel provides about 3% of the diesel energy needed in the state. Likewise, 9 ethanol plants using mainly corn to produce the ethanol, providing about 572 million gallons per year, which is roughly 10% of the gasoline fuel that at least goes into our tank, at least if it's E10 ethanol, providing something of the order of 14 million megawatt hours per year at the rates kind of shown there. Now, if we wanted to maximize our soy biodiesel and corn ethanol for the state, then we can make use of some agricultural data to figure out how much soy biodiesel and or corn ethanol we could produce if we went all in on it. So on the left hand, we can see the state average of soy crops in the state of Wisconsin is around 51 bushels per acre, and the state average of corn in Wisconsin is about 174 bushels per acre. Now, looking around on the Department of Agriculture information, we can see about 10.1 million acres of cropland were farmed in Wisconsin, at least as of 2017. And so that's a number I'll use to at least do some calculations for energy potential. And then looking again at some of the U.S. Department of Agriculture data, we've again got the average yield of corn, 172-ish bushels per acre. Likewise, soybeans, 52, 54 or so bushels per acre. So if we use those as the baseline for our calculations, and then looking at other U.S. Department of Agricultural data, we can find 1 bushel of corn gives about 2.7 gallons of ethanol. but the energy content of ethanol is only about 66% of that of gasoline. And likewise, about 1.4 gallons of biodiesel can come from 1 bushel of soybeans. So putting this all into a table, the average yield of ethanol from a bushel of corn is 170, well, yield of corn from cropland, 172 bushels per acre. Ethanol from a bushel of corn, 2.7 gallons. Energy content, the prospective volume, if we were to plant 10.1 million acres of corn, could give us about 4.7 billion gallons of ethanol per year, or 395 trillion BTUs of thermal energy per year. Same approach for soy, 52 bushels per acre, again 1.49 gallons per bushel, would give us 782 million gallons per year, or 108 trillion BTUs of thermal energy per year. Now, putting these all together, we've got our existing thermal energy output based on the 32 million gallons of biodiesel and 572 million gallons of ethanol. And then we can compare that to the actual thermal energy needs that are provided by gasoline and diesel, at least at the present time. In this case, I'm focusing on trillions of BTUs because that's a little more easy to work with. Now, if all of the cropland were planted as corn and all of that corn were converted to ethanol, we could get something of the order of 395 trillion BTUs of energy. Or if all of the cropland, 10.1 million acres, were planted as soybeans and all of that were converted to biodiesel, we could get about 108 trillion BTUs of thermal energy from that biodiesel. Now, carrying forward the existing gasoline energy needs and the existing biodiesel energy needs, we could say we could either go 100% ethanol and exceed our gasoline energy needs, or we could go 100% biodiesel and meet our existing diesel needs. And that's the sum of all transportation used in semi-trucks and trains, as well as all agricultural food used in planters and harvesters. Now, what I propose is basically splitting it 50-50. Take half of the agricultural land, plant it as corn for ethanol, and take the other half of the agricultural land and plant it as soybeans for biodiesel and get these numbers. Now, ideally, we wouldn't have to do that at all. We would be able to use cellulosic ethanol, which would make use of corn stover and leafy products rather than corn grains themselves to get that energy needs, but this is at least showing what the potential is based on existing use. Now, what this proposal right here would suggest is that if about 200 out of 300 trillion BTUs of thermal energy is provided by ethanol and all the gasoline weren't present, it would suggest about 2/3 of our vehicle fleet would have to be electric vehicles. So two-thirds would be gasoline vehicles, in this case running on ethanol instead of gasoline, which is a fairly straightforward conversion. And the remaining 33% would have to run on electricity. Now that's saying all things being equal, the energy used in 2017, 2020 would resemble the fleet of the future in 2050 or so. And it's worthwhile to note, when considering which direction to pursue, at least for transportation energy, that about 20% of the primary, we'll say end use energy going into the tank of a vehicle is actually used to move it forward in the case of gasoline vehicles, whereas about 90% of the energy in a battery of an electric vehicle goes to propelling the vehicle forward. So there are certainly improvements or gains to be had if one went with electric vehicle instead of gasoline vehicles. But what the analysis shows, at least, is that existing corn ethanol production methods or improved methods such as cellulosic ethanol could fuel the transportation infrastructure of the state of Wisconsin if used judiciously. Now let's tie this all together, and I want to point out that I made use of two separate but trustworthy sets of energy data for this energy audit. One of them comes from this Lawrence Livermore National University. They've got the Sankey diagram that's shown on this figure here, and I refer to these quantities, but I also leaned heavily on the Office of Energy Information data, which I consider more recent and more trustworthy in terms of actual quantities. And so I just want to point out there are slight discrepancies on these based on some of the data that they had collected or had available at that time. So on the left-hand side, we've got our resource energy. It's 1709 trillion BTUs from Lawrence Livermore National University, whereas Office of Energy Innovation estimated 1641. They're similar orders of magnitude. Likewise, electricity and electricity imports are both around 235 trillion BTUs from both sources. And then the end use energy, we've got 1279, 1224 from the respective sources. And conservation of energy, we've got energy in, energy out, some up to similar volumes. It's worthwhile to point out for the forthcoming analysis that I'm treating the future proposed Wisconsin energy portfolio as having the same energy needs that the existing portfolio that we see here has. Now, if we were to enact certain energy efficiency policies, such as insulating homes, residences, I should say, commercial facilities, and industries, then a substantial portion of this rejected energy could then be knocked out, and we would make it a little more attainable to hit our energy needs with the resources available in state. But again, if for some reason or another some public emergency arose whereby natural gas were cut off, coal were cut off, petroleum were cut off, and nuclear were cut off, then the proposed energy portfolio would have us maximizing hydroelectric, which we saw already, biomass, which we just saw, and now we're going to go into wind and solar using an energy audit that draws on this 1224 trillion BTUs of energy kind of expected for the residents, commercial, industrial, and transportation needs, and then taking into consideration the 235.7 trillion BTUs that manifest as electrical energy. So this figure right here takes the 1224 end-use energy that I mentioned earlier, 235.7 trillion BTUs of which I mentioned are electrical. And so subtracting 1224 minus 235.7 gives us 988.5 trillion BTUs of thermal energy, kind of expected by the residents of the state, at least based on the current energy portfolio. And then the rest of these are just converting trillion BTUs to megawatt hours of electrical and thermal, respectively. Now, if we consider what we already saw, we would maintain the existing nuclear facilities with their 10 million megawatt hours of electricity output, or 34 trillion BTUs. And likewise, if we were to expand the existing 2.5 million megawatt hours of hydroelectric to 5 million megawatt hours based on that new stream reach development audit done by the Department of Energy, then those would supply a portion of the electrical demand. And then as we saw earlier, there's about 64,800,000 megawatt hours of thermal energy from biomass available in the state of Wisconsin, which I arbitrarily partitioned into 50% thermal energy and 50% electrical energy, which is converted at 30% efficiency to about 9.7 million megawatt hours of electrical energy. So those are kind of things we've seen already. And then we also just looked at the proposed ethanol and biodiesel energy. I actually use trillions of BTUs in this case, where we would plant half of the 10.1 million acres of cropland as corn, and the other half of that 10.1 million as soybeans for ethanol and biodiesel, respectively. And thermal energy is what's necessary, at least for that type of transportation. So what that leaves us with is, if we take the demand here, 289 million megawatt hours of thermal energy, and then 69 million megawatt hours of electrical energy, what that leaves us with is something of the order of 184 million megawatt hours of thermal energy and 44 million megawatt hours of electrical energy. And for reasons you'll see in a moment, I divided those equally between solar and wind energy sources. Now, what this tells us then is that we might use, well, let me just add these together. We would need something of the order of 114 million megawatt hours of total solar energy and 114 million megawatt hours of total wind energy. Now, if these are photovoltaic devices, that 114 million megawatt hours would have to be collected by the photovoltaic arrays, and then the electric wind farms, and that would then have to be converted either through resistance heaters to the thermal energy, or better yet, through heat pumps, which would conserve some of that energy and thereby reduce the actual thermal energy load and draw in that other consideration, that other thing that I haven't addressed in particular, but it would make use of geothermal energy. So the reason I suggested an even split between solar and wind energy right here is because they are in many ways complementary. The Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation provided data on the capacity factors for solar and wind energy in the year 2020. And as you might expect, solar energy is at a minimum during the winter solstice when the daylight hours are shortest, and it's maximum in the month of July, kind of when the summer solar energy is typically, highest, longest days, sunniest days, and all of that. Conversely, the wind energy is actually at a minimum in July. It's a little harder to notice than sunlight, and it happens to be at a maximum in February, just in the winter months. So the complementariness of these two energy sources is the reason why I divided them equally on the preceding slide. Now, the other sources of renewable energy within the state that we already looked at, hydroelectric and then a couple forms of biomass, have pretty steady capacity factors. In fact, the hydroelectric is very stable in Wisconsin over the course of a year. And likewise, biomass and herbaceous biomass and then wood biomass can be quite stable as well. What I did propose earlier, though, is that these biomass resources at least be stockpiled during the summer, such that photovoltaic arrays could cover the majority of energy needs during the summer, and then allow them to be used during the winter when solar energy is at least low. And it might take like a wood chip electric power plant to supplement the electrical energy needed by the state during the winter. So we already looked at hydroelectric in biomass, and now we'll take a look at how it is that solar and wind would be built up to meet the energy needs for the state of Wisconsin and allow us to at least approach energy autonomy using in-state renewable, sustainable energy resources. So I'll start off with just a solar intensity map showing the state of Wisconsin in this lovely blue-green color here that gives us nice vegetation, but it doesn't really provide the sunlight and sunburn for some of us that these southwestern states has. And so what that plays out as is different levelized cost of electricity for well-vegetated, well-watered states in contrast to the desert states. And really what this boils down to is a major difference in performance of solar photovoltaic arrays and the payback periods. For a state like Arizona, you might have a payback in 5 years based on the current rates. For a state like Wisconsin, it might take 10 to 15 years for solar photovoltaic to pay for itself. But it is improving little by little, although it's beginning to stabilize as well. This is a depiction of solar intensity in Wisconsin, showing the lower third of the state has reasonable solar potential, maybe around 4.5 kilowatt hours per square meter per day, whereas the northern portions with their good forest coverage and cloudier days tend to have lower solar availability. And some other considerations come into play when trying to make use of solar energy to provide a majority of one's energy supply. One we saw earlier, we know that solar energy is only available from sunrise to sunset, and it really peaks around noon or so. And that then means that the excess energy available during the day has to be stored for use during the evening. And so this entails activity referred to as curtailment and use of storage such that you can collect more than the actual demand during the day and offset it a little bit for use later in the afternoon and through the evening. That presents a logistics and control challenge, but use of battery energy technologies do make that a little more feasible. Another aspect of this Department of Energy Solar Futures Study shows that given a proposed energy portfolio from 2020 to 2050 with various low carbon scenarios, in the summertime, it's realistic to collect a reasonable amount of energy, store some of that in batteries for use later in the day throughout the evening. Whereas in the winter, the low solar availability, these small yellow lines right there, means that adjustments have to be made either to collect more energy during the day or to supplement it with biomass and geothermal energy, which isn't really depicted clearly in this scenario, but is what I was implying when I said, given the biomass supply we can accumulate during the year, at least in the way of woody and herbaceous biomass, we should store that up during the summer to burn it in the winter, at least to generate electricity. And for those people who have the benefit of living near the power plant, perhaps combined heat and power as well. So in the energy portfolio, for the remainder of the portfolio, I posited a scenario. I looked at best and worst case scenarios where, at least in the worst case scenario, the capacity factor for photovoltaic is of the order of 4.8%, and the total daily total global irradiation from the sun is of the order of 1.226 kilowatt hours per square meters, or about 390 BTUs per square foot. Now, if you recall back to the energy audit several slides back, we saw we needed about 114 million megawatt hours of solar energy per year to provide the remaining energy needs for the state. If we divide that by 365 days per year, it means we need about 310,000 megawatt hours. Now, there are some losses associated with photovoltaic arrays, not only in converting the incoming sunlight to electricity, but also passing it through various electrical devices to obtain energy out that can then be distributed to the electric grid or used for home purposes. So on the one hand, photovoltaic cell efficiency is about 20%. So for every 1,000 watts of solar power going in, you get about 200 watts of electric power coming out. Now, when we add on all of these other components, such as the charge controller, the inverters, and various other equipment, panels, diodes, AC/DC wiring, shading, sun tracking on all that, we end up incurring losses. And the losses, at least from this table, I estimate to be about 72% losses from all of the conversion devices, excluding the cell efficiency. And then if we wanted to include batteries for overnight or afternoon storage, we incur a substantial charge discharge loss, which when rolled through gives us about 54% efficiency. So for every 1,000 watts of solar energy coming in, we multiply by the 20%, giving us 200 watts coming out, and then we'd multiply by the 0.54%, giving us about 108 watts of actual usable electricity to the grid. And this is a challenge that I'll try to illustrate with these slides here. So if we were try to attain 310,000 megawatt hours, the average energy requirement for an even split between solar and wind, it would necessitate something of the order of 835 square miles of solar panels. And I put this little panel array there to show the land area needed. Now, admittedly, that would be actually distributed, some concentrations near the major population centers, and then sparse areas scattered throughout the more rural portions of the state. But for an array that would collect enough energy, solar energy, to provide electricity based on the earlier audit sheet, it would cost about $365 billion. And likewise, if we were to include 1 day of battery storage in this as well, and include the incurred losses, this was that 0.54 as opposed to the 0.74% up here, then it would take an even larger solar array, something of the order of 40 miles by 40 miles, as is shown in this figure here, and that would cost about $674 billion in solar panels alone, and an additional $230 billion in batteries. I think it was lithium-ion batteries that I kind of specified for this situation. So these are admittedly costly. On the same note, we know that coal is diminishing, natural gas is getting pricey, and petroleum products, which aren't so much used for electricity, is also in limited supply as well. Now, if we take the same approach to wind power, we can see another Energy Information Administration map showing kind of the southeast third of the state has the greatest wind availability, but even there it's more or less fair, and further up in the north in the state it's fairly poor. And so this would obviously imply that we'd want to concentrate wind farms in the southeast portion of the state. And the good thing is that the majority population center, Madison, Milwaukee, and then the Fox Rivers areas are all in that area as well. Now, using the data, the capacity factors, the efficiencies we had seen earlier, as well as some reports from the Department of Energy, National Renewable Energy Lab, I did some preliminary calculations based on 2.6 megawatt land-based wind turbines that have a typical cost of $1,436 per kilowatt of nameplate capacity. And so using the same target energy levels, 310,000 megawatt hours per day, it would require about, and the typical spacing ratios of wind turbines, they're not spaced real close together. You've got to have appropriate spacing of the wind turbines in order to maximize the energy extraction. But in this case, it would be about a 60 by 60 square mile area for just collecting a day's worth of electricity. And then for a wind farm with battery storage, I scaled the battery system the same as the solar. It would take something of the order of 80 by 80 miles or so. And the total cost for these would be about 120 billion and 450 billion, respectively. Now, those numbers obviously sound outrageous, but it is worthwhile considering for both solar and wind. You could say that the longevity of those systems is about 25 years. So if we were to divide this by 25, and then the population of 5.8 million citizens, it doesn't seem as prohibitively expensive, although it would entail a significant investment over the course of the decades. Now, from what we saw, is that, in theory at least, hydroelectric, biomass, wind, and solar could cover Wisconsin's energy needs. But there is one last energy source that is at least worthy of consideration, that is nuclear energy. Referring back to the Hubbard chart I introduced several slides back, this is actually an original figure from the manuscript that M. King Hubbard produced in 1956, where it was already recognized that nuclear power offers a significant opportunity and substantially more energy than the petroleum even recognized at that time. And so Hubbard had produced this figure showing what in 1956 was the projected total petroleum use in the United States over the course of the century or so of its use, and then the nuclear energy potential recognized at that time. Now, it's necessary to point out that most existing nuclear facilities use uranium-235, and there's only enough of that to last about 30, 60 more years based on current usage rates. But other sources such as uranium-238 and thorium present the opportunity to provide substantial energy for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so this is something that's at least worth considering, given the contrasting energy density of solar, this happens to be a concentrating collector, versus nuclear. So it takes about 450 times more land to provide 1 terawatt hour of electricity than it does for nuclear energy. And there's some other gains to be had from it as well, such as the significant mass of materials needed for solar photovoltaic to produce 1 terawatt hour of energy. In this case, a combination of cement, steel, concrete, glass, in contrast to nuclear energy. So this is kind of the massive difference, not only in land area, but material mass of solar and hydroelectric, wind, geothermal versus nuclear. So I'm not strictly advocating nuclear, but I am saying that it does offer the potential to satisfy Wisconsin's energy needs using in-state resources. So here's an extract from an article from the U.S. Geological Survey showing the thorium ore distributions around the United States. And what is a bit of a surprise is that in the area around Wausau, Wisconsin, there are thorium ore reserves that could theoretically be harvested and used to produce energy for electrical energy, at least for the state of Wisconsin, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the benefits of thorium, it's about 3 times more abundant than uranium, and many thorium composites contain other valuable rare earth elements that could be obtained in the mining process. The waste products of thorium aren't very useful in nuclear weapons. It's part of the reason why we don't really want to pursue uranium nuclear power. And thorium waste products contain fewer radioactive elements with lesser volume than uranium-based wastes, many of which have a shorter half-life. So overall, thorium is far less of a problem than uranium, and something that Wisconsin should certainly consider, at least given the reserves in Wausau area, to provide something of the order of 10 million megawatt hours per plant, which can substantially offset the otherwise needed solar and wind energy that. Well, now we've arrived at the final section of the presentation on how it is that we can attain energy resilience. The earlier two were the energy audit and the energy autonomy, that is to say, getting ourselves weaned off of the need for fossil fuels. And now we want to figure out how we can improve the infrastructure to prevent statewide electrical and energy failure in the event of a significant public emergency. So I'll start off with a reminder of the goals: enhance the resilience of Wisconsin energy and information infrastructure against natural and man-made failures, And part 3 is recommend safeguards to minimize the likelihood of energy grid failure in the state of Wisconsin and evaluate options for disconnection from the national energy and information grids to prevent the possibility of being subsumed by the failure of adjacent systems. So I'll start off with an excerpt from Colonel John Perkins, a military official, a director of construction management facilities, who has already kind of recognized the concerns pertaining to resilience and what types of events could have an impact on the electric grid. So we're all aware of tornadoes and floods and winter storms, how it is that they can knock down power lines and basically shut off our energy supply for fairly brief periods. So their severity is regarded as fairly low. But up above, we see some high severity events, such as cyber attacks, shown on these figures right here, and or the geomagnetic disturbance, aka solar flare, or high altitude electromagnetic pulses that I discussed at the introduction to this presentation. So briefly addressing the cyber attack concern, turns out Microsoft Digital Defense Report, this one published in October 2021, has identified the major nation-state actors that pose at least a cybersecurity risk to the United States infrastructure. And you can see the main players are Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea. Some of you may remember having seen the Fancy Bear cyber attack on several government facilities. And this necessitates use or consideration, you could say, of all the defense mechanisms in place to prevent cyber attacks on computational equipment. And that's a little outside the scope of this presentation. I'm focusing more on energy infrastructure and maintaining it. So we'll move on, or I'll at least mention that, as you recall, the 2021 Colonial Pipeline hack basically disabled a significant portion of the Colonial Pipeline in the southeastern United States. Likewise, the Texas power grid failure caused by a derecho storm disabled much of the Texas electrical grid. But as we saw earlier, the threat posed by a high altitude electromagnetic pulse placed over Nebraska could cause the entire electrical infrastructure of the United States to become short-circuited, so to speak. And there's several ways whereby this could happen. On the one hand, there's local, small-scale damage that can be done by radio frequency weapons. And these, if they were to disable, say, some coal and gas power plants in a fairly localized region, could trigger cascading blackouts to a larger region, but they're not maybe as threatening as solar flares and high altitude electromagnetic pulses. Nonetheless, they can be mitigated at least with some radio frequency shielding on things like substation and control room doors. Bigger concern, especially if you read the literature, is geomagnetic disturbances, which again are solar flares, which essentially supercharge the geomagnetic sphere of the Earth and very often trigger northern lights, such as the famous Carrington event of the 1850s, I believe it was, that caused the northern lights to be seen as far south as Colombia. But these are infrequent events, although there are some expert astrophysicists who estimate that these could occur as often as once or twice per century. Some even say we're long overdue for some type of geomagnetic disturbance. And the National Coordinating Center for Communications at least ran a few scenarios where if an if a solar flare were to induce a geomagnetic disturbance, these portions of the grid shown here would at least be under pretty severe threat for cascading failures in such an event. But going back to what I mentioned earlier, perhaps the biggest threat, at least on a human scale, to the United States electrical grid is ballistic missile that may have some type of nuclear warhead on top. And as we saw The Department of Homeland Security has run several scenarios where a rogue nation might detonate a 300 kiloton nuclear warhead at 300 kilometers above Nebraska and thereby shut down a good portion of the electrical grid. So that's the one that's kind of addressed in the resiliency considerations proposed here. Earlier, we saw this plot as well, showing the so-called early time, intermediate time, and late time pulses that would arise from a high altitude electromagnetic pulse and the associated damage to information and controls technology, as well as power distribution lines, shown by the E1 and the E3 pulse, respectively. Now, it happens that this E1 pulse is the most dangerous to infrastructure, and 98%, I think, of the investments needed to provide resilience against it would be geared toward that E1 pulse. But just to give you a kind of depiction of how it is that such an EMP could damage the electrical grid, we could see things like undersea cable infrastructure is threatened by both E1, E3, satellites in space, satellite terminals, radio equipment, media, computers, internet devices, all vulnerable to the E1. Cell phones, desk phones, all vulnerable to E1. Routers, radio TV stations, all vulnerable to E1. And then other parts of the electric grid vulnerable to E1 and E3. And to give you a reminder of how it is that power is distributed, we start with energy conversion locations such as coal or nuclear power plants, which essentially convert the thermal or nuclear energy of coal and uranium into electrons, passing it through a steam turbine and then distributing it through the grid, sending it through a transformer that increases the voltage for distribution over large distances, where it is then stepped down at another substation and sent through distribution lines that are more or less scattered throughout the cities and villages that we live in. So electromagnetic pulses, as we saw, produce three distinct waves, and a geomagnetic disturbance, that is to say from a solar flare, produces a wave characteristic really of this E3 signal, the magnetohydrodynamic signal shown there. And there's a lot of guidelines for how it is that substations and all that can be protected from it. Say for protecting from E3, you would install neutral ground blockers on large power transformers. For E3 GMD, have spare circuit breakers at the substations. For E1, use electromagnetically shielded control houses. And then for grid restoration, after EMP events, have backup generators. And so those are all kind of the cost and equipment that are covered in this portion of the presentation. Now, the Center for Resilient Societies estimated the cost of protecting the U.S. electric grid from electromagnetic pulse. This is the same group that testified before Congress about the realistic threats that EMPs pose to the U.S. energy infrastructure, namely the Korean nuclear program and the Iranian nuclear program. They went through and calculated that it would cost the United States about $25.5 billion per year for this EMP production, and the vast majority would go for those so-called E1 pulses that pose a threat to virtually all electronics. And if this were divided among the 360 million people in the United States, it would cost each of us about $79 per year, or about a 7% increase in the electric bills. But keep in mind that's well worth it if it allows us to avoid trillions of dollars in lost gross domestic product and save millions of American lives. Some estimates say around 50%, even to 90% of the American population would be at risk. So EMP protection costs are driven by the generator technologies and largely dependent on the type of electronics needed to control those technologies. So the Resilient Society Foundation looked at coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydroelectric, and all sorts of different power plants, and based their estimated resilience protection cost on the portion of those plants, that is to say, that portion of capital cost that goes into the electronic controls. And you can see for at least coal, gas, and to some extent nuclear, much of the production cost can be of the order of 20 to 40% of the actual equipment. Meanwhile, some of the renewable, sustainable technologies that we looked at have negligible controls. That is to say, most solar arrays don't have a control room, they just have automated equipment, and most wind farms don't have a control room, they just send the power to the grid and it's used kind of accordingly. So the savings that one could realize if they chose to put their investments in solar and wind mean they would require less money to actually enhance the resilience of, say, gas and nuclear and coal-fired power plants. So EMP protection is estimated, would be estimated to cost the state of Wisconsin about $4,222,000,000 for a 10-year span. And this would play out as about $73 per person per year for 10 years of protection. And it would increase the electrical cost of Wisconsinites at least by about 5.7%. And the proposals made by this organization would be to evenly divide the costs of EMP protection among all the people paying utility bills. Now, there are some other alternatives to that, but this is at least one from which these numbers arose. Now, in addition to the energy infrastructure, there's also communications infrastructure and the associated information infrastructure that would be under threat by these same electromagnetic pulse or geomagnetic disturbances. And these require slightly different considerations, basically to ensure that all of the control rooms, at least in the state of Wisconsin, for our concerns, would be able to communicate with each other to basically jumpstart the grid in the event of a blackout, or at least properly divide power if the rest of the United States were blacked out. So communication systems vary in their vulnerability and resilience. As I mentioned, the electrical infrastructure requires some level of controls with communications to ensure proper power distribution and proper supply for whatever the public demand is at the time. And certain communications equipment is vulnerable to EMPs in the same way that the energy equipment itself is, but there are some methods whereby that concern can be lessened, such as use of fiber optic cables instead of copper cables for communication, because copper cables are susceptible, you could say, to a surge current that could be caused by the E3 pulse emitted from an EMP device. So there's actually detailed design specifications for hardening control centers against electromagnetic pulses to ensure continuous communication. And this is a depiction of an EMP resistant structure showing the grounding of certain key communications equipment, as well as an electromagnetically shielded enclosure with associated bandpass filters and various other technologies. Now, what they do include is supplemental equipment, that is to say, energy supplies that could be regarded as autonomous and independent, that would allow at least the communication centers that interconnect all of the different electrical infrastructure to continue operating. In this case, they show estimated costs using Stirling engines, but they all fall around $200,000 per substation. And the substations and control rooms and all those things, as I mentioned, would have to be designed for EMP shielding with a variety of modified cable points of entry to prevent an induced current from entering into the building and doing damage to all of the controls equipment within that building. Now, the military actually already has all of its communications and energy equipment shielded against electromagnetic pulses, and they've very well characterized what modifications are necessary in their military standard 188-125-1. So these are some examples of emergency power supplies that would be used in a shielded communications infrastructure setup. And they even have varying costs associated with how long it would be able to endure basically a grid-wide blackout from anywhere from 8 hours to a week or so, costing, well, in these cases, something of the order of dozens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to provide either the battery backup, diesel generator, fuel cells, things of that nature. So we already saw that for 10 years of electric grid resilience would cost Wisconsin $4.22 billion or $422 million per year. But keep in mind that's based on the existing infrastructure. And as we saw from the Hubbard curves, it may not be worthwhile to continue investing in coal and natural gas and petroleum power plants, but rather to replace those, at least to the best of our ability, with wind, solar, hydroelectric, and biomass. And so the proposed energy portfolio shown in the Objective 2 section would lessen the cost to Wisconsin because our proposed energy infrastructure would have a greater portion of solar and wind, which have negligible EMP protection costs. Likewise, in the case of communications protection and providing backup power to the communication systems with Stirling engines, fuel cells, or shielded solar arrays, it would incur an additional 1% cost, roughly, at least to residential consumers, to ensure communications resilience against electromagnetic pulses. So these resilience investments can prevent energy system failures in many ways. We saw this chart earlier showing generating stations, substations, wherever those are, control rooms, communication systems, customers, and all of that. And the investment in energy and communications resilience, as we saw, could save all of us a lot of pain and trouble if perchance, the leader of North Korea woke up on a bad day and decided he wanted to hit the United States. So beyond the military standard that I mentioned already, there's a few others that essentially provide guidelines for hardening, that is to say, increasing the EMP resilience of a variety of electronics and controls equipment, which would thereby protect the Wisconsin infrastructure in the event of a public emergency of that nature. Now, drawing again on Colonel Perkins' presentation, there's a concept referred to as the Camp Dodge energy security concept, a system you could say specifically designed to provide EMP protection to a military facility, making use in their case at least of some probably gas turbines, 3 megawatt battery, and then 2.5 megawatt solar system, all of which are essentially insulated or shielded, you could say, from electromagnetic pulses. Now, the U.S. military takes this very serious because in the event of such an event, an EMP by some rogue nation, it would still be incumbent on them to remain active and protect the country against any further activities. And so their guidelines for EMP resistance can be adapted to the public infrastructure with little or no modification, presumably addressing those portions of the infrastructure of the greatest concern. So they recommended, at least prior to the release of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, they recommended partitioning the EMP protection out at the state and federal level, making use of tax credits, loan guarantees, grants to perform this hardening activity to prevent failure due to electromagnetic pulses. But it happens that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act makes a lot of money, that is to say, literally billions and billions of dollars available to improving the resilience not only of the electrical infrastructure, but also water and wastewater, part of the critical infrastructure, hospital and emergency services, also part of the critical infrastructure, and as we saw, electric infrastructure as well. So I mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin Office of Energy Innovation already has Community Resilience Center grants available throughout the state, and 15 pilot projects were undertaken in 2020 with nearly $1 million of state funding provided to those different communities. More recently, the Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which, as we saw, makes $5 billion available just for hardening and enhancing resilience and reliability of transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure. That's in addition to many, many millions, billions of dollars available for other critical infrastructure. And if you haven't read the bill in detail, you'll see it's replete with references to improving the resilience of the U.S. infrastructure. And this is due in large part to the testimony of the EMP Commission before Congress, really for the past 20 years or so. So they did listen, they did respond, and they did make funds available. Now, as a reminder, I focused on the energy sector, one of 16 portions of the critical infrastructure, and we briefly touched upon the communications sector, what it would take to harden communications equipment, and that, as you understand, makes use of information to maintain and control the energy distribution within the United States. Now, as I said, several other sectors are also susceptible to failure if the energy infrastructure fails. And now I'll just kind of touch upon the water, wastewater systems, healthcare, public health, and emergency services sector, but I can't really go into detail given kind of the limited scope of this work. So, critical infrastructure includes the regular provision of drinking water, that is to say, piping it to our houses, unless we live in the country where we draw from a well. And currently, Wisconsin has 581 water systems spread among the many communities throughout the state. They use about 400,000 megawatt hours per year for drinking water, and the 98 largest use 79% of the energy. So this is one portion of critical infrastructure that would be a primary concern for securing in the near future, just in case something went awry, if war broke out or something. And so again, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act creates several programs to improve the resiliency and sustainability of public water systems. They're intended to fund projects that prevent drinking water from natural hazards, infrastructure failures, and to improve its efficiency and operation. These are available for public water systems that serve 10,000 or more people, again, to improve resilience. And if you read the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, resilience is a key word that's scattered throughout it. Despite its limited presence in public consciousness, it's certainly present in the consciousness of the Congress people who passed this Infrastructure Improvement Act. Likewise, it provides more resilience and sustainability funds for public water treatment centers. So the public water systems provide us our fresh drinking water. Public water treatment systems treat the sewage waste that could otherwise pose a public health hazard by allowing diseases, waterborne illnesses to propagate if those systems were to shut down. Beyond that, they also have money available for wastewater treatment centers to improve anaerobic digesters, methane capture technology, and this is something of the order of $20 million per fiscal year for these 2022 to 2026. So it happens that this Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Acts arose at a time perhaps when these are particularly critical, and I encourage any citizens who may be viewing this presentation to begin to look into the funds that might be available for their community to especially improve the resilience of water supply, wastewater treatment, and then emergency services and hospitals. There's also weatherization equipment, $3.5 billion for weatherizing, especially for low-income households and all of that, which would improve insulation in the building itself, repair furnaces, water heaters, refrigerators, all of that stuff. All of these can cut the energy requirements for a given dwelling and thereby reduce the overall end use energy load of that community. And so all of these should be picked up. This $132 million that'll go to the state of Wisconsin for those improvements should be picked up by those people for whom it may apply. So to kind of summarize the overall recommendations of this research project for the Governor Tommy Thompson Center, I've got some general recommendations and then some more specific ones. One of those is improve the thermal efficiency of buildings. I strongly encourage further development of soy-based polyurethane foam to maybe retrofit existing dwellings and for use in new construction to reduce the thermal energy requirements of those buildings and make heating the building less, at least with natural gas, less costly. Provide incentives to purchase double pane windows and have them installed, and then begin to develop expertise in air and ground source heat pumps that can substantially reduce the natural gas requirements needed to heat Wisconsin residences, commercial centers, and industries throughout the winter. Also, look further into locations where community resilience centers can be installed. This is perhaps making use of funds from the Office of Energy Innovation, where they've already done several pilot projects. And I would recommend prioritizing hospitals, senior care centers, and water treatment centers to make use of these funds. And then a significant consideration is pursue a 4-day work week. As you're probably aware, if people are commuting to work 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week, one can decrease their transportation energy by about 20%. If you're only driving 80% of the week to go to work, that allows for a substantial reduction in transportation energy needs. And then based on some preliminary calculations I had made, if you don't have to heat and cool the office buildings or industries for an additional day per week, that can provide up to 12% savings in stationary energy. Stationary, you recall, is commercial, residential, and industrial energy needs. So that a 4-day work week in its own right would provide substantial savings across all 4 sectors of energy and thereby reduce the number and cost of solar panels, wind farms, and all of that would be needed to attain energy independence. Continuing with the stationary sector, that is to say commercial, industrial, residential, my recommendation is to maintain the existing nuclear, which is providing about 10 million megawatt hours of electricity per year, add another 2.5 million megawatts of hydroelectric to attain a total of 5 million megawatt hours of electric per year, and then embrace the available biomass to target around 10 million megawatt hours from, we'll say, wood chips and corn stover per year and biogas, and then send the remainder, maybe 32 million megawatt hours for thermal energy to heat various residence, industry, and all of that. And then, whenever possible, retrofit existing coal-fired power plants to make use of wood chips, exactly as had been led by Ashland Light and Power Company, and likewise for existing natural gas turbines, convert them to biogas, at least in areas where the biogas concentrations would allow for that. And then, whenever possible, use combined heat and power such that the energy generated by the wood chips or whatever biomass you're using can also provide district heat to the residents and commercial centers, at least in the immediate vicinity. And as you may recall from the energy audit, when we summed up all of these, we were left with an additional 114 million megawatt hours of solar and wind energy required, at least to satisfy the existing demand. But keep in mind, any improvement to the thermal efficiency of homes and businesses would reduce the required energy from solar and wind, and thereby reduce the overall cost of this recommendation. Beyond that, for the transportation sector, as I said, if we worked a 10-hour day work week, we would have a 20% reduction in fossil fuels, or we'll say transportation fuels. And that would already make it easier to get by with our existing, ethanol and biodiesel. And other considerations is perhaps provide tax incentives to buy food produced in state, especially in season. The shipping cost associated with sending produce from the Central Valley region of California substantially increases the transportation energy used in the state of Wisconsin. And then as we saw, if we took the 10.1 million acres of cropland in the state of Wisconsin and planted half of it with corn to produce ethanol and the other half with soybeans to produce soy biodiesel, we could get nearly all of our transportation and agricultural energy from those crops. Now, preferably, we would use cellulosic ethanol instead of corn ethanol, and preferably we would use some advanced synthesis techniques, both of which have pilot plants in the state of Wisconsin, but they're not fully cost effective, although they're approaching cost effectiveness, especially as the price of petroleum increases. And then Wisconsin can prepare for public emergencies, at least with respect to the critical infrastructure, by the following improvements. For communications sector, secure communications energy to provide grid autonomy, that is to provide energy resilience and independent energy supplies, whether it's solar photovoltaic or biodiesel generators. Information Technology Center, isolate as much of the information in the energy infrastructure from the doors that can be exposed or accessed by cyber attackers through use of the internet, and then prioritize emergency services and healthcare and public health sector, that is to say ambulance, fire department, police departments, and then hospitals, senior living centers, and all of that. Allocate designated energy sources, whether it's solar, photovoltaic, or biodiesel generators or what have you, to ensure that energy would be available in the event of a statewide blackout to those portions of the critical infrastructure. And then finally, ensure that energy would also be available to the water services centers, that is to say the wells that provide municipal water to all the cities across Wisconsin, as well as the wastewater treatment centers, whether it's a combination of solar, battery, diesel generators, wind, or what have you, make these, I would say, the top priorities among the 16 sectors of critical infrastructure. We can design the existing infrastructure or modify it in such a way as to ensure that whenever a statewide blackout occurs, or even regional blackouts, that at least these sections of critical infrastructure would always have power available to them.